It all started with a single email that arrived while Staff Sergeant John Miller was still deployed overseas. After 13 years of marriage, his wife Karen Miller ended everything with 3 cold sentences. She had already filed for divorce, emptied their joint bank account, and moved her new boyfriend Michael Turner into their family home in Boise, Idaho. Imagine the shock of reading that while serving your country thousands of miles away, unable to defend the life you had built. But John was no ordinary man caught off guard. His years in the Army had taught him to trust his instincts. And long before this message arrived, he had noticed Karen changing late nights at the dental office, secretive phone habits, and a distant, distracted attitude. Quietly, John prepared for the worst. He placed family heirlooms and important documents in a storage unit, and even opened a private account so he wouldn't be left with nothing. Still, the email hit him like a grenade. Karen had not only betrayed their vows, she had invited another man into the very home John had fought so hard to provide. Behind that betrayal lurked an even darker scheme involving Daniel Foster, a real estate agent with his own agenda. What began as a broken marriage was about to unravel into something far more dangerous. Conspiracy that reached across state lines and preyed on military families like John's. John Miller had learned to read people long before his years in uniform. Soldiers call it gut instinct, the quiet signal that something isn't right, even before evidence piles up. And months before his deployment, those signals were everywhere in his home life. His wife, Karen Miller, once attentive and affectionate, had grown strangely detached. At first it was subtle. She stopped asking about his day, stopped waiting up for him after late shifts, and no longer laughed at his dry Army humor. Then the excuses came. Girls' nights, weekend getaways with friends John had never met, and a gym membership she rarely used but always seemed to dress for. He noticed the way she kept her phone closer, passwords changed, screens turned away. For a man who had risked his life in hostile deserts, these little things at home cut deeper than any bullet ever could. But John wasn't a man to chase shadows or hurl accusations. His father had taught him that patience often reveals the truth more clearly than anger ever could. So John prepared quietly, gathered his most important documents, birth certificates, the deed to their house, his military benefit papers, and placed them in a storage unit across town. He took his father's pocket watch and his mother's silver set, treasures from a family that had always stood by him, and locked them away where no one else could touch them. He even opened a private savings account at another bank, slipping a portion of his Army pay into it each month. It wasn't much, but it meant he would never start from zero if the worst came. The night before deployment, Karen had hugged him at the Boise airport. Her embrace was stiff, her eyes dry. She whispered, "Stay safe, okay?" As if she were saying goodbye to a coworker, not her husband of over a decade heading into danger once again. Deep down, John knew what that meant. Still part of him. Hoped he was wrong, hoped the woman he had loved since their whirlwind wedding would be waiting faithfully for his return. But the email proved otherwise. And as John sat on his bunk overseas, staring at the lifeless words on his laptop screen, the reality hit him. Karen hadn't just checked out emotionally. She had already started a new life with Michael Turner in his house, under his roof, financed by years of his sacrifice. What Karen didn't know, however, was that John wasn't the type to be caught completely unprepared. He wasn't a man who sought fights, but he was a man who finished them. The Army had trained him to keep calm under fire, to assess before acting. Now, that discipline was all he had left to hold on to. So when his bunkmate, Private Wilson, noticed John staring off into the distance and asked if everything was okay, John simply replied, "Just some stuff back home." That was it. No anger, no bitter words. Among soldiers, there was an unspoken understanding. You don't pry when a man's carrying a private war. But inside, John's private war was already underway. He remembered every sign he had ignored, every late night, every excuse. He remembered her saying once, "I didn't sign up to be a military wife," when he talked about re-enlisting. And now he saw the truth. Karen hadn't just fallen out of love. She'd been preparing to leave long before she ever pressed send on that email. In that moment, John made himself a promise. He wouldn't lash out. He wouldn't send threats or beg her to reconsider. Instead, he would do what he'd always done best: stay focused, stay patient, and build a plan. Because if there was one thing the army had taught him, it was that victory doesn't come from rage. It comes from strategy, and strategy was exactly what John Miller was about to bring to the battlefield. Back home, 2 weeks after that devastating email, John Miller's world took another hard hit. It happened quietly, almost without warning, while he was sitting in the mess hall overseas. His phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. At first, he thought nothing of it, just another routine alert. But when he opened the app, his stomach dropped. Almost $90,000. Their joint account balance had been drained, whittled down to barely $20. Even worse, the savings account they had carefully built over the years, nearly $50,000 meant for emergencies and their future, had been stripped clean as well. John set his fork down and stared at the screen, the laughter of other soldiers ringing around him like background noise to a life that suddenly no longer belonged to him. Families back home were calling, FaceTiming, catching up on birthdays and anniversaries, and there he was, thousands of miles away, watching the financial foundation of his marriage collapse with a single swipe of his thumb. Karen hadn't just left him, she had methodically dismantled everything they had worked for together. The bank later confirmed what he already suspected: she had been moving money in small amounts for weeks. Like a thief slipping coins out of a jar and then ramping up once he deployed. It wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was calculated, standing. In the hallway after that call, John felt hollow. He wasn't a man given to loud displays of anger. Instead, his emotions hardened into something sharper, colder. The tears he might have shed had dried up the moment he realized this wasn't just about a failing marriage, was about survival. That night, Wilson found him again. "Heard you looked like you'd seen a ghost," his bunkmate said. Up. John didn't spill everything, but he told the truth in the way soldiers often do, plain and stripped of drama. "My wife cleaned out our accounts, sent divorce papers while I was on patrol. She's moved another man into our home." Wilson didn't give him the usual cliches, "No, sorry, man, or you'll find someone else." He simply asked, "What's your plan?" Those words stuck with John. What was his plan? He had lived his life by strategy, by mission objectives, by never walking into a situation without knowing his next 3 moves. Why should this be any different? That night, unable to sleep, John logged into the home security system he had installed years earlier. Karen probably didn't even remember he had remote access. Camera feed loaded slowly, but when it did, the images cut deeper than any battlefield wound. There was Michael Turner, walking the dog John had picked out as a puppy, wearing John's favorite Seahawks sweatshirt, drinking from John's coffee mug. And there was Karen, laughing in the very kitchen John had remodeled with his own hands on his last leave. Something shifted inside him. Not rage, not sorrow, something colder. Soldier's clarity. This was no longer about heartbreak. It was about reclaiming what was his, about ensuring the sacrifices of his service weren't thrown away. Like yesterday's mail, he pulled out his notebook and began to write. Called David Harper, Army buddy turned lawyer. Check VA loan terms. Contact commanding officer about emergency. Leave. Review. Pension account security. Investigate. Home refinance documents Karen had mentioned last year. It wasn't a list of what-ifs. It was a battle plan. By the time dawn broke, John knew exactly what he had to do. He wasn't going to storm home in a fit of anger. He wasn't going to scream or plead. No, he was going to do what he had been trained his entire adult life to do: gather intelligence, assess the field, and strike with precision when the moment was right. Because John Miller wasn't just a husband who'd been betrayed. He was a soldier. And soldiers don't quit the fight, they adapt, regroup, and win. Back in the desert, John Miller carried on with his duties as if nothing had happened. That's what soldiers do. You bury your own pain so the mission can continue. But every evening, when he returned to his bunk and checked his phone, another wave of betrayal would hit. 2 weeks after discovering their savings had been drained, John saw the bank app light up again. This time, it wasn't just withdrawals. It was a full transfer, nearly $89,000 in one sweep, leaving their joint account almost empty. His stomach twisted. All those years of careful saving gone in an instant. John didn't lash out. He didn't call Karen to scream at her or send a long, angry email. Instead, he followed the instinct that had kept him alive through firefights and ambushes. Stay calm, gather intel, and plan. That very night, he went to the base phone center and called the bank directly. The representative confirmed his worst fears. Karen had been draining the account since the very day he deployed. First small amounts, then larger sums, till she finally bled it dry, standing in the hallway after the call. John watched other soldiers laughing with their families on the phone. Kids telling their dads about soccer games. Wives sending love across static-filled lines. For John, that world was gone. His family was slipping away, replaced by a stranger who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle. That was the moment his heartbreak hardened into focus. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about survival, financial, emotional, even spiritual. He had given Karen 13 years, his loyalty, his income, and the roof over her head. Now she had stripped him of nearly everything. But she had underestimated the man she married. When Wilson, his bunkmate, asked quietly if he was all right, John gave him the simplest version. My wife emptied our accounts, sent divorce papers while I was on patrol. She's living with another man in our home. Wilson didn't try to comfort him. Instead, he asked the question that mattered. What's your plan? Those words hit John like a command. A soldier without a plan is already defeated, and John refused to be defeated. That night, he opened his laptop, logged into the home security system, and saw images that cut deeper than any battlefield wound. There was Michael Turner, walking John's dog, sipping coffee from John's mug, lounging in John's sweatshirt. And there was Karen, smiling in the very kitchen John had remodeled with his own hands. John felt no tears, no explosion of rage, just a cold clarity. This wasn't just infidelity. This was invasion. His home, his finances, his very life were being taken over piece by piece. And if there was one thing the army had taught him, it was that you never let the enemy dictate the battlefield. He pulled out a small notebook and began making a list. Called David Harper, his army buddy turned lawyer. Check the VA loan terms tied to his house. Review pension and retirement. Accounts for vulnerabilities. Look into the refinance. Karen had mentioned offhand before. Deployment, contact his commanding officer about emergency leave if needed. This wasn't scribbling. It was strategy. Each line was a mission objective. Each step a move toward regaining control. By dawn, John knew he didn't need to shout, threaten, or confront Karen directly. He didn't even need to tell her he knew. All he had to do was watch, wait, and prepare. Because every action she took was digging her own trap deeper, and when the time came, he'd be ready to close it. For now, he returned to his duties. Outwardly calm, but inside every part of him was focused. He wasn't just a betrayed husband anymore. He was a soldier on a new battlefield, one where the enemy wasn't a foreign insurgent, but the woman who once vowed to stand by his side, and John Miller was determined not to lose. By the time John Lee Miller had gathered himself, he knew exactly what he needed to do next. Bring in reinforcements. In the army, you never fight a battle alone, and this fight was no different. That's when he reached out to David Harper, an old army buddy who had left the service and built a career as a lawyer back in the States. David had been with him through some rough deployments, and if there was one man John trusted with both his secrets and his future, it was him. The secure call was short. To the point, the way men who've been through war together talk. John explained what had happened, the drained accounts, the divorce papers, and his suspicion that Karen and her new boyfriend were up to more than just betrayal. David's tone stayed calm, steady, but his words cut through the noise. John, you need to be ready. What she's done isn't just personal, it's criminal. Within days, David uncovered something that chilled John even more. Karen hadn't just taken the savings. She had forged his name on refinance documents tied to their home, pulling out a staggering $330,000 loan against the property. On paper, it looked like John had signed it, But the signature was off, sloppy in ways only someone who knew his handwriting well might overlook. And the co-signer, none other than Michael Turner, the man now sleeping in John's bed. John sat on the edge of his cot in stunned silence. Forging a signature was fraud. Using his VA-backed loan without his knowledge wasn't just fraud, it was federal fraud. This wasn't a messy divorce anymore. It was a full-scale operation. David's investigation dug even deeper. Michael wasn't some innocent boyfriend swept up in romance. He had a record, 2D UIs, and even a fraud charge from years back. Yet he wasn't acting alone. There was another name that kept surfacing. Daniel Foster, a real estate agent known for fast cash deals. Piece by piece, a larger picture formed. Foster and Michael had a pattern. Target. Vulnerable women offend, the spouses of deployed soldiers, convince them to sell homes quickly and cheaply, pocket the difference, and disappear before anyone could connect the dots. The forged refinance wasn't just about Karen wanting money. It was part of a scheme, one that had likely claimed more than one military family before John ever knew what hit him. That realization didn't just make John angry. It made him focused. Betrayal in marriage was one thing, but preying on military families while husbands and wives were risking their lives overseas? That was a battlefield John couldn't ignore. He and David began to build their case like soldiers preparing an ambush. John documented every suspicious detail, from the security footage of Michael parading around his home to the bank withdrawals that lined up perfectly with his deployment. David gathered legal records, combed through loan documents, and traced financial transfers. Each discovery added fuel to the fire. Each one proved Karen hadn't just walked away from her marriage. She had joined forces with criminals. At night, when the desert grew quiet and the stars stretched endlessly above, John would sit with his notebook, refining his plan. He wasn't going to return stateside broken, penniless, or humiliated. He was going to come home prepared, with truth on his side and the law as his ally. For the first time since that email had arrived, John felt something close to strength. He wasn't helpless anymore. He was a soldier on familiar ground gathering. Intelligence, identifying the enemy, and planning his strike. Karen thought she had ended the marriage on her terms. But John Miller was about to remind her of something she had forgotten. Soldiers don't quit, they regroup, they adapt. And when the time comes, they finish the fight. When John Miller finally landed back on American soil 2 months later, he carried more than just his duffel bag. He carried a plan, sharpened by long nights in the desert and guided by every ounce of discipline the Army had drilled into him. He didn't call Karen to announce his return. He didn't storm the house or demand answers. Instead, he checked into a small motel under a different name and met David Harper, his lawyer and trusted friend, at a diner miles outside Boise. David slid a thick folder across the booth, his face grim. Inside were the documents that confirmed everything they feared: forged signatures, fraudulent loan applications, and financial transfers that painted a damning picture. But there was more. John David said quietly, "This isn't just Karen and Michael being reckless. It's organized. It's bigger than you." The name Daniel Foster kept appearing tied to quick-sale real estate deals. Transactions showed patterns: military families, fast cash offers, undervalued homes flipped for profit. Michael Turner wasn't acting alone. He was part of something larger, a scheme that preyed on men and women serving overseas. John sat back, the weight of it sinking in. His personal betrayal was painful enough, but to learn that other soldiers, brothers and sisters in arms, had been targeted in the same way, it lit a fire inside him that betrayal alone never could. David continued, "They're smart. They wait until deployment, isolate the spouse, make promises, and then bleed them dry. You weren't the first, John, but maybe you can be the last." That thought stayed with him. For the first time, he saw his pain as part of a larger fight, one that mattered beyond just his own marriage. The next move was risky, but necessary. John logged into his home security system, the cameras he had installed before deployment, and handed David his phone. Together, They watched as Foster and Michael strolled through John's house, discussing numbers, pointing out features, talking like they already owned the place. Their words were casual, smug, and damning. David hit record. "This," he said, "is evidence. Real, undeniable evidence." It was time to call in heavier firepower. David reached out to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Within days, John was sitting in a small federal office, across from Agents Patel and Donovan, recounting every detail. They listened carefully, taking notes, asking precise questions. When he was done, Patel leaned forward and said, "You've given us what we needed. This isn't isolated fraud, this is conspiracy. And now, with your case, we can move." John left that office with something he hadn't felt since the day his father first taught him to swing a hammer and stand tall purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every military family who had been blindsided the same way. Over the next week, he and David watched carefully. They didn't rush, didn't confront Karen, didn't tip their hand. Instead, they let the scheme unfold, documenting every move. John's anger had cooled into something more dangerous: patience. He would let them dig their own hole deeper until they couldn't climb out. One morning, parked down the street from his own house, John watched Karen leave for what she thought was a secret meeting. Minutes later, Daniel Foster's car pulled into the driveway. Logo of his real estate business painted right on the door. Michael met him outside, the two men shaking hands like old partners. Inside, John's cameras captured the conversation. Foster promised a fast sale at $420,000, well below value, while Michael bragged that John would take a settlement to make it all go away. That was the moment John knew the trap was ready to spring. He forwarded the footage directly to Agent Patel with the simple message, "Happening now." Within half an hour, FBI vehicles swarmed the street. From his car, John watched his agents lead Michael and Daniel away in handcuffs. For the first time since that cold email overseas, John felt a measure of satisfaction. This wasn't revenge. This was justice. And deep down, he knew something else. His personal pain had become the key to exposing a crime that reached far beyond his marriage. The scheme was over. The predators had been caught. And for once, the system had worked to protect the very people who gave everything to protect their country. When the FBI raid ended and the dust settled, the quiet street in Boise was left with neighbors staring from behind curtains and news, vans circling like vultures. John Miller sat in his car, watching agents carry out boxes of documents, computers, and evidence from the very house he had once called home. That house's house had become a crime scene. Standing on the lawn was Karen Miller. Pale and shaken, her hands pressed against her mouth as Michael Turner, the man she had chosen over her husband, was driven away in handcuffs. 413. Years she had been John's partner, his confidant, his wife. Now she stood exposed, her future uncertain. While the man she had gambled everything on revealed himself as nothing more than a common criminal, John asked Agent Patel the question that lingered in his mind: what happens to her? The agent's answer was careful, measured. It depends on what she knew and on what you want. It was the first time John realized he held a measure of power in this mess. Karen might face charges for forgery, fraud, even conspiracy. He decided to take a different path. He thought about it long into the night. The betrayal burned, but deep down, John was a soldier, not a man who thrived on revenge. What he wanted wasn't her destruction. What he wanted was justice, fairness, and a clean break. The next morning, through his attorney David Harper, John laid out his terms. Karen would sign away all rights to the house, his military pension, and any future claims. She would make full restitution for the money she had siphoned from their accounts. And most importantly, she would provide a written confession about forging his name on the refinance application. She agreed John would not push for federal charges. When Karen was presented with the choice, she broke down in tears. She said Michael had convinced her John was hiding money, that he was planning to abandon her with nothing. She claimed she didn't know about the larger fraud, that she had only followed his lead. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. By then, John didn't care anymore. To him it was simple. The woman he had married no longer existed. This Karen was someone else, someone who had traded loyalty for lies? And whatever excuses she gave couldn't erase the fact that she had betrayed not only her husband, but the home and life he had fought to build. So John let her go. The divorce was finalized. 6 months after that first email overseas. No fault, clean break, but with Karen stripped of any claim to his assets. For John, it wasn't victory in the sense most people imagine. It was more like closing a door on a chapter that had gone rotten, making peace with the past so he could begin again. Michael Turner and Daniel Foster weren't so fortunate. Both men accepted plea deals, implicating each other in a string of fraudulent sales targeting military families. Their greed and arrogance had finally caught up with them, and the sentences were heavy at years for Michael, 12 for Daniel. When John received the call from Agent Patel confirming the sentences, there was no celebration, no fist pump of triumph, just quiet relief. The scheme had ended, justice had been served, and other military families would be spared from the same trap. As for Karen, she moved back to her hometown in Oregon, taking a job at another dental office. Word traveled quietly through old acquaintances she was starting over alone, her reputation stained. Her choices catching up with her in ways no court could fix. John didn't hate her. In fact, after everything, he didn't feel much at all toward her. Hate required energy, and he wasn't willing to give her any more of his strength. What he wanted now was peace, something that couldn't be stolen, forged, or betrayed. And as he looked ahead to his new life, he carried with him not the bitterness of betrayal, but the steady conviction that integrity, patience, and quiet, determination had carried him through. Because in the end, John Miller hadn't just survived his wife's betrayal. He had turned it into the very thing that ended a criminal operation and gave him a second chance at life. By the time the ink dried on the divorce papers, John Miller knew one thing for certain: he could never live in that house again. It wasn't just walls and a roof anymore. It was the place where Karen had whispered lies, where another man had walked his dog, worn his sweatshirt, and drunk from his coffee mug. Every corner carried the weight of betrayal, and no matter how much justice had been served in court, those memories clung like smoke after a fire. So John made a decision. He would sell the house, not because he had to, but because he wanted to reclaim his freedom. He wanted to close that chapter completely and build something new, something untouchable, in the weeks that followed. He moved with deliberate care. He sorted through the belongings one box at a time, making 3 piles: go, stay, travel. The go pile. He packed his personal history family heirlooms, his military medals, the pocket watch his father had carried every day of his life. In the stay pile, he placed the things Karen had brought into the marriage. We didn't want them. They belonged to her past, not his future. And in the travel pile, he set aside the bare essentials that would follow him to his next chapter. But John didn't just pack boxes. He sent a message, both practical and symbolic. Every single item that had belonged to Karen or to her family, he had shipped back to her with a handwritten note attached, returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. It wasn't angry. It wasn't spiteful. It was final. When his son Mark showed up with a lawyer in tow, pressing him to reconsider selling the property, John stood his ground. "This house is mine," he said plainly. "The mortgage is in my name, the deed is in my name, and the decisions are mine to make. I am not a resource to be managed." His voice never rose, but the firmness in it made it clear he was done being pushed, guilted, or manipulated. One evening, after the movers had finished hauling the last boxes, John stood in the empty living room, the same room where he had once returned from deployments, to Karen's smile, where laughter had echoed during holidays, and where he had imagined growing old together. Now it was hollow. He locked the door behind him, slipped the key into his pocket, and felt lighter than he had in years. Not long after, John received the final documents confirming the sale. The house was no longer his burden. With that chapter closed, he set his sights on a different kind of life. He bought a modest cabin just outside Missoula, Montana. 2 bedrooms, 10 acres of land, and a creek that ran clear and cold behind the property. There were no neighbors in sight, just endless sky and the sound of wind through the pines. For a man who had spent 20 years in the army, living among barracks and bases, it was the first real taste of solitude and peace. He adopted a German shepherd, loyal companion he named Scout. Together, they walked the land each morning, the crisp Montana air filling his lungs. In the afternoons, John busied himself with carpentry projects for locals building shelves, repairing fences, crafting tables. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it kept his hands steady and his mind clear. His military pension covered the rest. One day, as he pinned the final set of legal documents to a corkboard in his cabin, John paused. The battles of the past, the betrayals, the courtroom fights, the FBI investigations were behind him. What lay ahead was something simpler, something he had longed for but never thought possible. A life that belonged entirely to him. No more lies, no more schemes, no more stolen trust. Just a man, his dog, and a cabin in the mountains. And for John Miller, that was more than enough. Life in Montana had a rhythm John Miller hadn't known in decades. Each morning, he rose with the sun, fed Scout, and walked the property while mist still clung to the trees. The army had trained him to live by schedules and missions. But here the mission was peace, quiet work, steady hands, and the satisfaction of building something with wood instead of watching something crumble. Yet even in that peace, there were days when silence weighed heavy. Nights when he sat by the fire, staring at the flames, wondering how 13 years of marriage had unraveled so completely. He didn't dwell on Karen anymore, but memories have a way of lingering, sneaking into the edges of thought when the world grows too quiet. Then one afternoon, the mail changed everything. Among the usual bills and flyers was a handwritten letter addressed simply to Mr. John Miller, Missoula, Montana. Inside was a note that stopped him cold. "You don't know me," it began, "but you saved my home." The letter was from a woman in Fort Worth, Texas. Her husband, a Navy sailor, had been deployed when the very same scheme that had nearly cost John everything was aimed at her. The FBI had reached her family just in time, because of the case John had helped build. "They told me your name," she wrote, "and said your courage and persistence gave them the evidence to break this operation wide open.
Oh, my children.
I still live in our house today because you refused to walk away. Thank you for fighting back when it would have been easier to give up." John read the letter twice, then a third time. And when he pinned it to the refrigerator, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long while: purpose. Up to that point, John had seen his ordeal as personal. Marriage destroyed, a home poisoned by betrayal, years of savings nearly stolen. But now, in that letter, he saw the larger picture. His pain hadn't just ended in justice for himself. It had protected other military families, men and women who, like him, had gone off to serve and trusted that their homes would be safe. That knowledge didn't erase the betrayal, didn't erase the hollow nights or the memories that sometimes came unbidden. But it gave those years of heartache meaning. Something good had risen from the ashes of his marriage. In the weeks that followed, whenever the silence of the cabin pressed too hard, John would walk over to the fridge, run a hand across the paper, and remember that letter. It reminded him that he hadn't fought in vain. His pain had been transformed into protection for others, and that was worth holding on to. Life moved forward. Michael Turner remained behind bars, serving 8 years for fraud and conspiracy. Daniel Foster was serving 12. Karen was gone, living somewhere in Oregon, trying to rebuild whatever life she could piece together. Now no longer wondered about her choices. They were hers to carry. His were different. He had chosen peace. He had chosen integrity. He had chosen not to let bitterness harden his heart forever. Most evenings now, John would sit on the porch of his cabin with Scout at his feet, watching the Montana sky burn orange and purple as the sun dipped behind the mountains. He'd take a slow breath, feel the cool air, think about the long road he had walked. He hadn't planned to be the one to bring down a criminal ring. He hadn't asked to become the man whose case would protect others. But sometimes life works that way. The worst moments become the spark for something bigger than ourselves. And John Miller Once a soldier, once a betrayed husband, now simply a man in search of peace, found comfort in knowing that his scars had meaning not just for him, but for countless others. A year after his divorce was finalized, John Miller finally closed the book on the life he once shared with Karen. The house had been sold, and the money reinvested in something that gave him peace instead of paying a quiet cabin outside Missoula, Montana. It was simple, nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a wood stove in the corner, 10 acres of land where he and his German shepherd, Scout, could roam without interruption. Behind the cabin ran a creek, its steady water carrying away the weight of memories he no longer wanted to hold. For a man who had spent 2 decades in the Army, surrounded by orders, routines, and deployments, this new life was an adjustment. But it was also a blessing. He could wake with the sunrise, split wood for the fire, and drink coffee on the porch without checking a duty roster or wondering when the next mission would pull him away. Every so often, he heard news from his attorney. David Orr, from Agent Patel. Michael Turner remained in prison, serving his 8-year sentence. Daniel Foster, the real estate agent who had orchestrated so much of the fraud, was serving 12. And as for Karen, she was back in Oregon, working at another dental office, living quietly. John didn't hate her. He didn't wish her ill. The truth was, he simply didn't feel much at all anymore. She had made her choices, and he had made his. One afternoon, while working in his small shed, John paused to read the letter pinned to his refrigerator door, the letter from the Navy. "Wife in Fort Worth. You saved our home," she had written, thanking him for refusing to give up, even when it would have been easier to walk away. That letter reminded him that his pain had not been wasted. His case had helped the FBI shut down a fraud ring that preyed on military families. Our other husbands, wives, and children had been spared because of him. Sometimes when the silence in the cabin grew heavy, John would think about all those families. Men who had deployed like him, trusting their homes would be waiting, only to discover betrayal instead. He knew their pain because he had lived it, but he also knew there was a way forward through patience, resilience, and the refusal to surrender, and that became John's life. Not one defined by bitterness, but by quiet strength. He did small carpentry jobs for locals, repaired fences, and built bookshelves for neighbors. His pension covered the rest. He wasn't rich, but he was steady. And after all, he had endured. Steady was enough. Evenings often found him on the porch, Scout at his feet, watching the Montana sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and violet. In those moments, John felt something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not the kind born of wealth or status, but the kind that comes from surviving the fire and still finding a way to stand tall. John's story reminds us that betrayal may break our hearts, but it does not have to break our spirit, even in the darkest. Moments when trust is shattered and life feels stripped away, we can choose resilience over revenge, dignity over despair. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't loud or dramatic. They are quiet, steady choices to keep moving forward, to build a life no one can take from us. So let me ask you, have you ever faced a betrayal that forced you to rebuild from scratch? How did you find your strength? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if John's journey moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more stories of resilience, justice, and the power of the human spirit.